All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you for joining me on another week of the podcast. And this week, I want to talk about college football, NIL, where it's going, the money, and everything that encompasses it. So, what really got me interested in this topic this week was the story of what's happening at UNLV and subsequently what's been happening at some other institutions as well. Their quarterback, Matt Sluka, I think is how you pronounce his last name. The team was 3-0 heading into this last weekend against Fresno State. And he went ahead and said that he was going to take a red shirt and enter the transfer portal immediately. And he's able to do that because of the new rules that are in place, centered around NIL and transfer portal and all that stuff. And the reasoning that he gave, because it seemed a little odd on paper, because UNLV was 3-0, they felt like a group of five conference that had a chance to make it into the college football playoff. And it seemed like they were trending in the right direction with him at QB. But it then came out that they had an NIL agreement that the university did not fulfill. So after that kind of happens, the basic agreed upon situation was that him coming from Holy Cross, he was going to play his year at UNLV for $100,000, and he had not seen that money. He had maybe seen $3,000 of that money. The issue that has come across is that it's really been a he said, she said sort of thing, because Sluka says that he hasn't been paid. UNLV says that they have fulfilled their agreements. And the family recently hired another agent, and it seems like a lot of the issue here is that the price of yesterday is not the price today, where the team is doing better, he's performing, so on and so forth, and he wants to be compensated more for what he's bringing to the table. The issue is that none of this was on paper. It was a sort of a handshake agreement between the NIL fund of the university and the player, and as a result, no one can really be punished. All that can really happen is that he could claim a red shirt and then move on. Now, since then, there have been a couple other players, another UNLV player, their running back, who has also done the same thing, taken a red shirt and basically been released of their obligations to play for the university. And it kind of illustrates this wild west of college football right now, where there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of teams moving around, there's players moving around, there's money being given out, and it's kind of bordered on chaotic, right? Where you can't really get a handle on who's where, who's doing what, and it's all just moving so fast. And I think it's about time we have a conversation about why more rules and regulations around transferring and around the way we're paying players needs to be addressed in the college game. So let's start off with getting things on paper. To me, it's insane that somebody or anybody would agree to a $100,000 agreement and not get some form of contractual obligation for that agreement, right? Like, if you're going to play for a college that's a higher level than where you're at right now, one of the ways they're going to get you is by saying, hey, we'll pay you X amount of dollars to be able to be our quarterback this year or whatever position you are. And you say, hey, sounds great. I get more exposure at this school. Maybe I could get into the NFL if I play well, and I get paid to do it. Sounds like a great deal. Then they say, all right, cool, we're going to give you $100,000 for this year. At that point, you should probably be asking, how am I getting paid this? Where do I sign a contract to hold you guys accountable just in case you don't want to pay me? Right? And the crazy thing is, it's not like colleges historically have been saint-like. They've often taken advantage of their student athletes. They've often engaged in nefarious activities, especially boosters and the people who run these NIL collectives. So if you're the player, why wouldn't you want to protect yourself there? Now, if you're UNLV, if you, let's just assume that the player's telling the truth, you look like shit compared to other schools in your conference and other schools in the region and across the country, where people are going to be looking at you and say, oh, yeah, they don't pay their players what they say they're going to. It's just a scam, right? So no one's going to want to transfer to your school. It doesn't matter if you're offering them $1 million or $2 million, right? And that it sullies the reputation of a school like UNLV. It also is a misfortune for the player by not giving them what they thought that they were owed. And we can't even know who's right and who's wrong because there's nothing on paper. So that's the first thing that needs to happen, right? You need to have it on paper. Next thing is, NIL is kind of going crazy. And I wonder if there should be contracts that are signed now. And the reason why the NFL works, even with all the movement and all the players that switch teams all the time, is that they're contractually obligated, right? So if you decide you want to commit to Texas for 1 year, I feel like you should probably have to sign a contract to stay at least a year. And if you want to be released from your contract, there has to be some sort of penalty, whether that's money or a delayed start at the next school, whatever the case may be. There has to be something here where it can't just be in the middle of the year a player's like, I'm not getting the desired playtime that I need, even though when I signed up I knew what it was. Like, in theory, a player could go in and commit to UCLA, and they're a linebacker, and they say, all right, cool, I'm going to commit here because I have a good chance to win the linebacker job, and, this could be a potential path to the NFL. Then once they get into camp, they get beaten out for the job, they could just transfer out just because, right? And I feel like there needs to be a little bit more structure because ultimately what this kind of limits is people embracing the sport of college football, right? There's no recognizable names. There's no people that are attached to an institution. Look at Alabama, for example. People like Alabama. People know who Jalen Milroe is because he's been there now for a couple of seasons, and there's an association with the brand. Whereas if you're a player who's jumping from school to school to school, that becomes more difficult. And if you're allowed to just jump mid-season, then it becomes even more of a chaos loop, right? And then we get into the idea of, should there be a salary cap? I think we've been playing this charade of this is name, image, and likeness. When name, image, and likeness came out, the proposed idea was like, hey, they could benefit off their name. So let's say Cam Ward at Miami gets approached by a South Florida car dealership to do a commercial, that he can get paid for that. That's what NIL is supposed to be. What it's turned into are these NIL collectives that just say, hey, come to my school, I'll pay you money. And not that surprising that college football would devolve to that, because they were probably doing that anyway before it became quote-unquote legal. So what you have now is just like a bidding war all the time. And they're kind of skirting away from the idea that they are, in fact, a professional entity. And they could deny that all they want, but you look at the facilities at a school like Georgia or Alabama or Clemson, the type of facilities they have, and you're trying to tell me that's not a professional operation. Alabama now has a GM. They've hired a GM. Adrian Wojnarowski, formerly NBA insider for ESPN, has joined his alma mater at St. Bonaventure to be their GM for their basketball talent. So don't tell me it's not professional, because they're hiring positions that are typically associated with professional sports. And it's just you're benefiting off of the brand that a university has. So you're benefiting off of University of Michigan or Ohio State or Michigan State or whatever the case may be, that has a cachet with fans and a cachet with the fan base, because it's easier to cash in on that than it is to create your own league of semi-pro college football and market it as a pipeline to the NFL. We see that with the NBA G League. College basketball still outperforms the G League by a wide margin, and that's because we know Duke, we know North Carolina, we know Kansas, we know Kentucky. We don't know the Fort Wayne Mad Ants, right? Like, that's the way that works in terms of building a brand. These colleges have built a brand since the 1950s, and they're cashing in on those brands, but they're basically professionals, right? So what the salary cap does basically would cap every single league into its own number of amount of dollars that can be allocated, right? And I think that that sort of a framework has to come down the line, because after a while, the rich will just keep on getting richer. Like in the state of Texas, Texas will start getting all the players, and then what's left for UT San Antonio or Texas State, or even TCU or Baylor or Rice, those type of schools who are recruiting the same players, but Texas could give you a lot more. Why? And it's unlimited. Why wouldn't you just go to Texas, right? And that's where I think it's an erosion kind of the middle class of college football, where there's no, like, those lower level schools are going to get money to go into Tuscaloosa, into Austin, and get their faces kicked in, but get paid a bunch of money to do so. Or you're going to have the high end schools are going to have all this NIL money and all the TV revenue coming in. That middle class, those schools that win 6-7 games, they're kind of becoming less and less common, and they can't get the players, especially as more and more of these colleges start funneling in more money. So it's really become a little bit of a kind of like an arms race. And it makes me think that, are we that far away from college football players forming some sort of players union and having a negotiations for a collective bargaining agreement with each of the conferences? Like, if you're a player in the SEC, you should probably be able to understand that there's like a minimum salary, a maximum salary that can be offered, as opposed to the system that we have now. And it continues to be this thing where they shy away so much from the professional aspect of this, right? Like, oh, you're going to school and all this stuff, and it's like the whole student-athlete thing being muddled all over again. But it's chaotic right now. It's all over the place. Everybody is kind of figuring out the best way they can get the player. And the only way you get the player is by figuring out ways to get more money. And they have all these NIL collectives, and a lot of times you could really look at the fact that the colleges were kind of pressured into all of this because there was a really big public sentiment to pay the players, which I think was accurate considering how much money like a Florida State or a Florida or something would be getting from their talent on the field in terms of merchandise sales, in terms of ticket sales, in terms of brand name recognition. Like, the University of Florida isn't a Jordan school, without the likes of a Tim Tebow going there and bringing them national championships. So there needs to be some level of structure here where you sign on with the team, you got to stick it out for that year. Even if it's just a year-to-year contract, that's fine, which is how most of the players handle it anyway. This situation at UNLV feels very unique, but it also illustrates the potential for this to continue to happen over and over again as soon as somebody is unsatisfied. And I think that there's a line, right? Before this, it used to be that it was really hard to transfer. That's why you didn't see it as often. Like, it had to be really bad for you to want to transfer. Now, it feels like it's the slightest inconvenience and players want to transfer. And I think we have to find a middle line. The middle line is, if you sign on for an NIL deal, it should be in a written contract that the university is obligated to uphold. If the university doesn't uphold it, they should be fined. They should be fined. They should be docked a scholarship. Because that's just bad business practice, and they should be penalized for having a bad business practice. On the players' side, I think that the introduction of performance-based contracts could be appealing. So let's say for somebody like the UNLV QB, let's say it's $100,000 and they agreed to that. But in the contract's like, hey, you win X amount of games, win a conference title, get to the playoff, it's this much bonuses. That would, in turn, allow a player like that to stay because they have a potential for bonuses when their team does well and they lead them to success, as opposed to just saying, I'm going to leave you high and dry and because you're not paying me. And it's that transactional nature, I think, that a lot of people are kind of grossed out by. They don't want to hear the player have to say, well, they're not paying me, so I'm not going to play, because there's this big like team camaraderie thing when it comes to football, especially, maybe even more so than any other sport, where you're in the trenches with these guys, you gotta stick it out with these guys and all that. And the player's like, hey, look, I agreed to come here for a certain amount of money, and you're not upholding your end of the bargain, so I'm just gonna go ahead and leave. And I think in that respect, the players are always going to lose that PR battle because so many people are so hooked on college football. I think it's the second largest sport in the U.S., honestly, after the NFL, that they're going to say, wow, greedy player, doesn't want to make any sacrifices, doesn't want to do one for the team. When you have a written contract, when you have agreed upon deals, agreed upon bonuses, and agreed structure, then you can look at it and say, hey, that's going to be enough to hold everybody involved accountable. And if you start taking away scholarships, start taking away the amount of offers that the teams can make if they don't hold their end of the bargain, that holds the universities accountable. Because we got to stop pretending that this is not a professional league at this point. Realistically, every single one of these leagues, especially the big-time ones like the Big Ten, the SEC, the Big 12, ACC, they are all big-time leagues, professional leagues that are benefiting from media deals, they're benefiting from upgrading facilities, they're benefiting from all this stuff. So they should be treated and arbitrated like a professional entity, because that's exactly what they are. Otherwise, we're going to see this continue to happen over and over and over again. It's not going to be a one-time situation. There's going to be a thing where like some player, like Ryan Williams at Alabama, a 17-year-old freshman wide receiver, insane. He's definitely going to the NFL. He could just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm the best receiver in the country right now. I should be being paid more. And it's on Alabama to negotiate that. And if he doesn't get what he wants, he could just easily say, I'm a redshirt, and I'm going to find another NIL package to go to, find a different team to go to, and what's in my best interest. And realistically, what's in Ryan Williams' best interest is to continue playing at Alabama when he gets all these national TV games and he could showcase his talent, so when it comes time to jump to the draft, he's a very highly touted prospect. I just think we're on a little bit of a dangerous path here when it comes to college football. There has to be guardrails in place. There has to be some level of policing here. And the NCAA is not going to be it. I think it really ultimately has to come back to the conferences, where the SEC negotiates this and the Big Ten negotiates these sort of agreed upon salary caps. I think the big schools, if they mirrored one another to prevent competitive advantages, that could help in terms of leveling the playing field. Because right now, if all the good players are going to go to a certain school, like, who's to say that we're going to get any talent at a lower level school, unless it's somebody who's like trying to redeem themselves after an injury while they're at the bigger school? It just feels a little unsustainable. And I would like to see a little bit more structure involved. It's kind of why I prefer the NFL game now, because as much fun as college games can be, as much as I enjoy watching them, there's still a gross factor in the way that they handle and go about getting players. And you hear stories like this. I'm sure there's hundreds of more stories like this that haven't really been publicized. So, I'm hoping that in the future we see colleges really focus in and adhere to some level of structure and just accept the fact, like, hey, you are a professional league that's using the brand of a college to generate more revenue. And that's okay. That's okay. You just act like a professional league, and, we could all accept it for what it is and move forward with our lives. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up another episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, follow, rate, and review the pod. It is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Until next week, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, Deep Cover Podcast. We'll see you later.